Hello, Jim. It's a pleasure to have you on Meet the Makers. And to our audience members, welcome back to another episode of Meet the Makers, where we talk with global disarmament stakeholders and look at how the Convention on Cluster Munitions contributes to peace, security, and development goals. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with retired Colonel Jim Burke, military advisor to the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, on the historical perception of cluster munitions and how and why the view on their military utility has shifted in the 16 years since the adoption of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Jim, welcome. And can you please take a minute to introduce yourself further and just share a bit about your involvement during the CCM negotiation process in 2007, 2008 as military advisor for the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs? Welcome.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you very much for the invitation. I acted as a military advisor to the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs on a range of conventional weapons issues from 1995 up to 2021. So I had been dealing with landmines and explosive remnants of war within the framework of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, known as the CCW Convention, for many years. When the Oslo process on cluster munitions was initiated by Norway in February 2007. Throughout the Oslo process, I had particular responsibility for developing provisions on the clearance of unexploded cluster munitions, which subsequently became Article 4 of the CCM. And I chaired informal consultations on these issues at subsequent meetings of states in Lima, Vienna, and Wellington. I also attended meetings of the core group that steered the process during this period. The core group comprised Norway, Peru, Austria, New Zealand, Mexico, and the Holy See, as well as Ireland. At the diplomatic conference in Dublin in May 2008, which negotiated the CCM, the president of the conference, Ambassador Dáithí Kelly, asked me to chair consultations on definitions in Article 2, in addition to Article 4. So these were all the definitions in Article 2, except that of a cluster munition itself and that of a cluster munition victim. I also participated in a large number of bilaterals, meetings with other national and organizational delegations as part of the presidential team during the diplomatic conference.
Wow, thank you. So, it's fascinating to hear you talk about that role. Obviously, that puts you in a somewhat unique position in terms of your understanding both of the convention and obviously, as you just explained, the weapon itself. In terms of the hardware of the weapon, a cluster munition or cluster munitions, what are they? What do they do? And what is it about their makeup that led Ireland and other states to champion an international ban on the weapon?
Well, there are many different types of weapons that fall under the general understanding of cluster munitions, and that was one of the major issues during the process was to elaborate an acceptable definition of cluster munitions. Originally, they were designed as an area weapon to engage enemy forces, and enemy forces would typically try to disperse their assets in order to minimize casualties. So the classic cluster munition consisted of a cargo munition, either dropped by aircraft or fired by land-based rocket systems or by conventional artillery. This cargo munition would contain explosive submunitions that would be dispersed at an optimal height in order to optimize dispersal and would generally explode and impact with the ground or with vehicles or any other targets. The early explosive submunitions were anti-personnel in nature, progressing quickly to dual-purpose munitions with an anti-armour shaped charge, and later to combined effects munitions with an additional effect such as incendiary. The fundamental flaw from a humanitarian perspective was that the large number of submunitions required to produce this effect, um, since every munition has a failure rate, the numbers of unexploded submunitions were consequently very high, leading to substantial post-conflict hazards. Environmental factors such as soft ground, vegetation, bodies of water, etc., as well as the chaos of combat, further increased the failure rate. Many of these remnants were also very sensitive and could explode on any further contact, greatly magnifying the risk to civilians. The nature of the weapon enabled it to achieve its military purpose, even with a relatively high failure rate, which is unusual. The wide footprint of these munitions also heightened the risk of striking civilians and civilian objects at time of use. During the Indochina wars of the 1960s and 1970s, huge numbers of early cluster munitions with a high failure rate were dropped by the US, on Laos in particular, greatly increasing international concern. In the case of Ireland, Irish Army personnel were deployed to the Union Force on its establishment in 1978, in the immediate aftermath of Israeli cluster munition strikes in their area of operations. The hazardous and persistent nature of these unexploded remnants was immediately apparent to Irish UNIFIL personnel. On my own engineer officer course in 1979, we were already being trained in dealing with this new threat. And a variety of submunition remnants have been brought to Ireland to assist in our training. On my first tour of duty in Lebanon in 1985, these remnants remained a major hazard, with new duds appearing every time the ground was ploughed or after heavy rainfall. On a subsequent tour in 2000, when Israel withdrew from Lebanon to the Blue Line, we destroyed many more remnants as the local population began to move onto lands that had been inaccessible during the occupation. Further use of cluster munitions in Lebanon by Israel in 1982, and in particular in 2006, increased the concern of the Irish and other governments, at the same time as Norway was inviting states to Oslo to discuss a total prohibition. Already existing concerns about inherent lack of discrimination, high numbers of unexploded munitions, and long-term humanitarian harm were greatly exacerbated by the 2006 war in Lebanon. And these concerns fed into the Oslo process, which led to the adoption of the CCM just over a year later. I disposed of my first cluster munition in 1985 and was still disposing of them in 2000. So it was a persistent problem.
Thank you. That I'm really glad that you offered your personal experience there. I think that in my estimation, one of the pieces of this story that often lacks or in the sort of high level discussion is the sort of firsthand account. Of course, it's as in the recent MSP where we have survivors in the room. That's an excellent way to tell that story. But it's also extremely interesting to hear your perspective as ex-military advisor, as you said, first seeing a weapon in 1985 and dealing with those weapons still in 2000, or the remnants, I should say. That's that just sort of paints a picture as well. Your reference to the use in the Indochina conflict, and as we well know, those remnants still maiming people today and still being cleaned up today in Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So thank you very much for that, the background. The concept of preventing unacceptable civilian harm appears as a key tenet in the negotiation process, and one on which most parties, listening to your description, seem to subscribe to, however, by differing means and definitions. Can you describe briefly the weapons prohibition that was eventually adopted and the significance of that standard overall, please?
The Oslo Declaration committed states to prohibit cluster munitions that cause unacceptable harm to civilians. And as I said, this was a political declaration that hadn't got the precision of a legally binding instrument. And one of the of the issues that wasn't defined or wasn't precise was what is a cluster munition? To many participants, particularly those from civil society, all harm to civilians was unacceptable, while many states felt that their munitions, both the munitions they produced and those that they possessed features such as self-destruction and self-deactivation that would minimize civilian harm. During 2007, the Oslo Process Core Group decided to aim for a total prohibition of cluster munitions as defined. And as there was no universally recognized definition, a great deal of the negotiation was focused on defining what would be and what would not be included in the definition of a cluster munition. The definition of cluster munitions that was finally adopted was a very complex one and a very exacting one, but it prohibited almost all the then existing submunition based weapon systems. In brief, then, at the end of the negotiation process, in order to avoid inclusion in the definition and thus to avoid prohibition, ammunition had to have fewer than 10 submunitions. Each explosive submunition had to weigh, um, more than 4 kilograms. Uh, each explosive submunition had to be designed to detect and engage a single target object, and each must contain an electronic self-destruction mechanism and an electronic self-deactivating feature, which essentially was a munition that had a very low possibility of becoming an explosive remnant of war, and which had systems to ensure its accuracy at time of use. So I think that is like a very brief synopsis of the role that the definition played in the final shape of the convention. There's a couple of other points that came up during the negotiations. For example, the question of explosive bomblets, which was another term that wasn't defined and was defined in this convention for the first time. And these essentially were bomblets that were uh, dispensed from dispensers uh, on helicopters or on aircraft, and just sprayed the ground with small bomblets. They weren't technically cluster munitions because they didn't come from a cargo munition, but because of the humanitarian hazard that they presented, it was decided to include them within the definition, to treat them as if they were cluster munitions for the purposes of the convention. There was a number of other issues as well, such as munitions whose primary purpose was electronic warfare or purpose was to attack power grids, etc. They were not included because they weren't explosive and their primary purpose wasn't explosive. So there was a bit of tidying up to be done around the edges of the definitions. But ultimately, even for states who are not party to the CCM, from a practical perspective, they have been working with the definitions that are set out in the CCM because they're the only definitions that have been generally agreed from an international perspective.
Well, yeah, it occurs to me listening to you that the I issue today, and we'll come back to this in a moment in a question, but that the definitions and the coverage of the convention is truly impressive, uh, and it works. The issue seems to be less with the definitions per se than in the application of that or implementation, as they say. So, but thank you for giving that broad overview of the definitions. As a former military officer and an official of one of the principal state supporters of a ban, you were and are in a somewhat unique position to understand how cluster munitions were viewed from a military and a humanitarian perspective. Specifically, can you talk about the perceived military utility of cluster munitions in addition to what you've already mentioned, and how this has changed since the convention was adopted in 2008?
Yeah, all weapons will have some military utility, or else they probably wouldn't exist. However, there are times when the humanitarian harm caused by a weapon outweighs its military utility. Um, Anti-personnel landmines and blinding laser weapons are examples of weapons that were deemed not to be capable of being used in compliance with IHL. The military utility of cluster munitions was based on the requirements of the Cold War era, where there was a priority on engaging enemy armoured formations, artillery positions, and logistics installations. In addition to the high levels of humanitarian harm caused by cluster munition use in Laos, Lebanon, Iraq, and the former Yugoslavia, there were also many instances of unexploded remnants impeding the progress of friendly forces in combat, and of course of impeding peacekeeping forces in post-conflict stabilization operations. The CCM has ended much cluster munition production, and the market has since contracted significantly. There has also been a stigmatizing effect amongst non-state parties, which was fairly uh, subdued, but does include the United States, who have rarely used cluster munitions since 2003, and which doesn't itself appear to have produced cluster munitions since 2019. Technology has also progressed over the past 16 years with significant improvements in targeting. Um, Conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, and Lebanon have demonstrated the value of unitary guided munitions. These range from highly complex systems, such as those that would comply with the CCM definitions, to strike drones operated by one person, such as the first person view drones supplied to Ukraine, which can give every soldier a long distance anti armor capability. Future technology developments are pointing in the direction of increased use of guided unitary munitions or munitions with low numbers of sub-munitions. In short, cluster munitions would appear to have a lower utility today than they had in 2008, when 107 states agreed to prohibit them at the Dublin Conference.
Thank you. I was just reflecting on your points you just made, and thinking on the impact of the convention since it was negotiated in Dublin and adopted in 2008. And in fact, I mean, I think we can say it's had a remarkable preventative impact. It came into force between the stigmatization, but also as of 2023, all states parties with stockpiles under the definition that you provided for us, they completed destruction of those. So literally, those states that had those, amongst those at the time 107, as of last year, as you know, to 112 states parties, they completed destruction of all stockpiles. So, um, these are big advances. These are big moves forward. I think we can all agree. And there's a wide understanding of the weapon as inhumane. Those small number of states today that are using the weapon actually have denied using the weapon and have even accused their opponents of using the weapon as a sort of bringing this up visibility-wise in the international diplomatic arena. So we do see that they have this negative stigma. And yet, we've also seen, you mentioned a couple of examples more recently, well, use of the weapon, but also increasing targeting of civilian populations and infrastructure in conflicts, and challenges to IHL principles. We're also seeing a massive global rearmament, including transfers of cluster munitions at this time. So, as you are also aware, we've seen recently a move by a state party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions to withdraw from the convention. And the concern is that all of these actions or trends potentially normalize the use of the weapon. So, a question to you: would be as a former military officer with an acute knowledge of cluster munitions and of what the convention has managed to achieve since 2008. What would be your sort of personal message to military colleagues, be it in Lithuania or be it elsewhere, who may be considering or reconsidering what has been termed military utility of the weapon? Would you have a last message for colleagues and military peers around the world?
Yeah, well, first of all, I suppose Lithuania has been a very sharp wake up call for the convention, for IHL generally. And I would hesitate to get too specific about what is now a sovereign decision uh, by a former state party. But I suppose the starting point, what I'd say about Lithuania is that Lithuania has never before possessed cluster munitions. So therefore, in my view, any future acquisition of cluster munitions by Lithuania would fall within the remit of Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1, to which Lithuania is a state party since 2000. And therefore, all new weapons and means of warfare should be assessed for compliance with IHL. So therefore, such an analysis should be carried out by Lithuania, notwithstanding the fact that they've left the convention, on any proposed acquisition of cluster munitions, in order to determine whether, from their perspective, these present a humanitarian problem. And it is a matter of regret, I think, that a more coordinated effort was not made by states parties to engage with Lithuania, including on the military utility of the weapon, prior to the final decision being taken on the matter during the summer. But however, as I said, Lithuania has submitted this instrument of withdrawal, and I suppose our attention should be primarily directed at states that might be considering a similar course of action, or to states which have yet to join the convention. Firstly, I think we must be aware of IHL, that IHL is important from a military perspective also. These are solemn, legally binding undertakings by sovereign states, and military forces are key to their implementation by states. They are not options that can be jettisoned when the security climate deteriorates. In fact, they are designed for the worst case scenario, which is international and non international armed conflict. IHL provides us with a floor to the behaviour of soldiers and to the nature of weaponry that are used in modern warfare. While much of the focus of recent concern is harm to civilians, very understandably, IHL also protects combatants, including the wounded, prisoners, and other hors de combat military personnel, as well as military forces engaged in peacekeeping operations. So IHL covers a wide range of issues, and cherry picking one or two is dangerous to dissociate from one or two parts of IHL undermines the entire floor which IHL is providing us with. Secondly, states should consider, as they should have done back in 2008, and I'm sure they did in 2008, the circumstances in which cluster munitions would have military utility and measure it against the potential humanitarian harm. Firstly, cluster munitions will have utility only against certain targets, in particular armoured formations similar to the Cold War era. They are not very useful, for example, in asymmetric warfare, as proven in Lebanon in 2006. Their high failure rate will impede friendly forces in addition to causing civilian harm. Cluster munitions must also be delivered from a platform. Air-delivered cluster munitions are dependent on a clear air superiority, which not many states will possess during armed conflict. Cluster munitions delivered by land-based artillery are also dependent on being able to protect those platforms from air attack, including drones, and from counter battery fire. The evidence from recent conflicts strongly indicates a move away from high volume, unguided cluster munitions towards more accurate and guided unitary munitions or weapons with low numbers of submunitions. The market in cluster munitions has been greatly reduced by the CCM. Some non-CCM countries retain large stockpiles, but use them rarely, as more effective options are available to them. Therefore, there is a risk that such non-CCM states may seek to transfer large volumes of older cluster munitions, such as the PICM, for example, to friendly states in need, thereby reducing their own stockpiles of outdated munitions. And we can see some evidence of that happening in the recent past.
Thank you. Thank you overall for that very comprehensive look at, at the weapon from your experience and your background. It's very insightful. Just to mention a couple of points I know we've been sort of glossing over, of course, IHL, International Humanitarian Law. I thought those points that you just broke out on that specific issue are extremely illuminating. IHL providing a floor for combat, and that while indeed in humanitarian disarmament, we're looking at civilian protection as sort of the holy grail, but in fact, these provisions protect combatants as well. So they protect the same armed forces that may be potentially employing them, or they could be deploying them. And this issue of proportionality that you just mentioned, measuring utility in today's combats against the potential harm, and not just potential harm, the real harm we know from examples you've mentioned in this discussion, um, needs to be a huge consideration. And obviously, any of the, or I should say, all of the CCM states have already made that balance and decided that there is no argument for use of this weapon, and that argument is being put forward to those states that are not already on board. So, with that said, I would offer the floor to you for any last comments that you may have before signing off.
Yeah, I think, like, just to summarize, there are two factors which I think come together uh, to make cluster munitions an unattractive option. One is the overwhelming evidence of humanitarian harm at time of use and post-conflict, which was the inspiration behind the Oslo process. Secondly, is the changing nature of warfare, the changing nature of weapons, of the huge improvements in technology, particularly in targeting, uh, particularly in sort of low and low cost high tech solutions, which have been fielded in recent conflicts, beginning in Syria and now moving on to Ukraine, and even in recent times in the various conflicts in the Middle East. We've seen a wide variety of innovative technologies being used by both sides. So I think that would be my summary, that there's both a humanitarian and a military imperative to move beyond the use of cluster munitions.
Thank you, Jim. Again, retired Colonel Jim Burke from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. And once again, a large thank you to you, Jim, for taking the time to speak today on Meet the Makers. Look forward to continuing the conversation, and all the best to you. Thanks.
Thank you.